Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. We are slowly coming to the end of. Oh, I forgot this is the next season. All right, let me start over. Sorry. Three, two, one. Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I am so excited to start off our next season. Today, we're talking to Shaun Dougherty. He is a professor of education and policy at Boston College, where he applies quantitative methods to study how education policies shape human capital and equity, with particular attention to income, race, and disability. He's a national expert on career and technical education and accountability policy, with his research being published in leading journals and cited by major media outlets. He has received funding from the Institute of Education Sciences, the Smith Richardson Foundation, and the Institute for Research on Poverty, which named him an early career scholar. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks, Calvin. It's nice to be with.
Yeah, I'm really excited. We're all both also in Boston at the same time, which is nice. I feel like recently I've been talking to people all over, but it's kind of cool to be in the same city and have these conversations. So it's getting cold finally, I feel like. I was just thinking about that today morning.
It is. This is definitely true to seasonal exposure here in New England, though I understand it's going to pop back up. But this is why I'm here. I love this.
Yeah. I love always starting with origin stories because I feel like everyone in education usually got there in really interesting ways. So I'm curious to even know for you how you found your interest in education. What was, what was it that led you in this direction?
So I'll try not to make it too long, but essentially, when I was in high school and college, I worked as a camp counselor, and I really liked being a camp counselor. I liked working with young people. I liked how the variety of the sorts of interactions, the opportunities, even for informal teaching and mentorship. And I thought about becoming a teacher, but I didn't want to have to give up so many course credits when I was in college. So I didn't pursue a traditional teaching certification. I went and became a research economist and started a PhD in economics. And lo and behold, I found I really liked Friday mornings when I got to be a teaching assistant. And so I finally thought, I'm probably not going to get the job I want as an academic. And I know that I like teaching. I'm going to see if I can find a path. So um, at the time, Massachusetts had an alternative certification pathway for people who had STEM degrees, and did a few other courses, passed a certification exam. And after clearing all that, I got a couple job offers, and so I leapt into teaching. Did that for 5 years, got a master's in administration, kind of moved into administrative work for a few years, and this was all at the peak of test-based accountability, No Child Left Behind. I was at a large comprehensive high school, and we were not making adequate yearly progress. And that's relevant because my stats and math background got me pulled into doing some data work for my school and my district, and doing some intervention work, and even using research-based methods and even applying some of the data that I had access to. I found that I didn't feel confident that I knew what we were doing was actually good for students, good for teachers, good for schools. Um, but I knew there were ways that I could get training to study this with stronger tools, better data. And so that's what led me back to grad school, always with the intention of doing work that was connected to education, social policy, and practice, so that it could have some relevance because it's really informed by this decade pathway into education and education research.
Hmm. I mean, I'm so excited to have this conversation today because similarly, I have a background in mathematics and data science, and I have always been fascinated by education, and I now do this full time. And I think the reason this is really interesting, so I run a book club where a few professors and people just meet up and we talk about a different education book. And so right now we're reading Diane Ravitch's Reign of Error, which I find to be really interesting. And I think a lot of what my own journey in education has been is coming from a background that was so quantitative. I really did believe for a long time education could be understood if we were to able to create these like the right metrics, if we were able to, I really thought it could be quantified in some ways. And I feel like the more and more I'm learning, I'm realizing how much of a challenge that is. And so I'm excited to kind of hear your opinions and thoughts because I want to first start with what are some of the main challenges you've seen when it comes to even thinking about how we go about quote unquote measuring education? Because there's so many aspects that can be measured. In your own experience, what do you feel like is the most important to measure and why? I'm throwing the big one at you. I'm sorry.
No, that is the question. That is the question that if we can't, here's the thing. One of the challenges is this idea of most, right? Of most important, and the idea that like across half a dozen or more things that we might hope to be an outcome of formal education, that one stands out. I mean, for understandable reasons, literacy and numeracy have been given privilege. And I think we have lots of evidence, plus I think lots of intuition that reading, writing, communicating, and the ability to interpret data is an important foundation. So to that extent, I don't know that we've gotten that wrong, right? In terms of privileging that in education over the last century and a half of public education in the United States. Um, and I'd say that that seems pretty universal. I don't think it's even like an entirely Western thing. I think that like literacy, numeracy are at the core. Beyond that, we do ask people to spend a lot of time in schooling. And as the world has gotten more technical, as credential accumulation has accelerated, there's even greater need for folks to perceive at least that they need to be in school. And one of the challenges that creates is having school be a relevant and positively reinforcing space. So this is a long lead up to, I think, being meaningful, connecting to purpose is an important part of schooling because there's a fraction, relatively small, of the population that's just intellectually curious and wants to learn all the time and is willing to put up with modalities that may not be ideal. There's another larger, much larger fraction of the population that understands that part of society and schooling is being compliant and going along with the rules. Um, and then there's another part of the population for whom like those first two don't really apply, and the lack of relevance or the abstractness or the failure to really connect education to the rest of life or possible pathways through life is a challenge. And so in that sense, I think the most important thing is that we help people connect to what it is they're meant to learn and find some meaning or purpose in it so that it can sustain them, right? Whether they need to be sustained on their 10-year post-secondary journey through becoming a surgeon, or whether it's their 6-year journey through becoming a plumber's apprentice and going through the process to becoming a fully licensed and independently operating plumber, right? So it's really purpose and meaning, finding value in the process that I think has got to be at the core of what we do.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I think the challenging thing is that seems to be the hardest thing to measure. I mean, how connected does someone feel to something? Seems to be far more difficult to measure than do they understand something. I mean, just in the chapters that we had read for the last reading, Diane Ravitch says something interesting. She's like, the the thing that you can't really capture is how much does someone, with the awe that someone feels when they look at something, the fascination, the curiosity, those things are, but you can measure. And she was just like, a good teacher, the teachers that people usually remember are not the ones that allowed them to perform the best on a test usually, but it's the one who sparks a certain level of like that, all of a sudden the world looks so much more beautiful now because you've kind of expanded your lens of the world through this one medium. And so how do you feel like for especially for that third point, are there ways that you can even try to quantify that?
I don't know that we have one off the shelf, so I certainly can't point to something like tomorrow, if everybody used this, survey measure, we would have a better insight. That said, we know all sorts of things about how to create measures, right? Of all sorts of constructs. And we do this with regularity. Social sciences and psychologists in particular, there are all sorts of scales that have been developed. Like grit is an example of one scale that was developed and has gotten lots of attention.
Did you say
Um,
grit?
Grit,
Grit?
that's right. Um, and you know, certain scales gain prominence, and we make good use of them. I think that there are ways that if we chose to emphasize this, and this has not been at the core of my work, but presumably could be, is figuring out ways to measure that. Ask people, right, through survey measures, come up with a validated measure that has good measurement properties, and then have that be part of what we put into regular educational practice. Now, all measures can fail. It's not as if measurements is the one best solution, but I think we could get a better handle on it than we do now. Right now, we rely on things like attendance, right? Do people show up to
Yeah.
school? Do they participate? Do they not get in trouble, right? We use negative measures of engagement that are
Mm,
pretty extreme, like antisocial measures, and they definitely signal a problem. But we don't have a lot of like affirmative measures that I'd say that we collect, but we could develop them and we could collect them on a more regular basis. And then if we use that information, it might benefit students in schools.
yeah. I think one of the philosophically really interesting thing about any measure is if you took even standardized tests like SATs, for example, I think at its core, if you were able to come up with some metric and you said everyone just blindly goes into this test based on what they know they're able to reproduce and do their best, you get some, I feel like you then get some relatively accurate measure of where someone is in that moment. But then the second now people start training for it, preparing for it, they spend all these extra hours just studying for the test. I feel like now what you start measuring is not someone's just natural what their abilities are. You're just measuring a correlation of how much time they spent studying for this one outcome. How do you, when it comes to something like education, which doesn't actually capture someone's education, it just captures more someone's time and resources often. And so, how do you now kind of, anytime you use a metric, yeah, I don't know, how do you get the buy-in? Because here's the other problem. The other challenge is if you don't have a buy-in, so someone might just say, I'm done. Why am I even taking this test? It doesn't even mean anything to me. There's zero buy-in. So the buy-in has to be somewhere in the middle where there's just the right amount of buy-in where they still try, but not enough to where they spend their whole lives studying for this one thing. Because then you're actually moving away from the whole purpose of education, as you maybe to connect or something else. So that I think with any metric is really the philosophical challenge.
I think that that's right, and I think like you did a nice job of paraphrasing more or less my understanding of Campbell's law, right? That the more attention we give to any particular measure, the less representative it's likely to be of the thing that we were actually trying to measure to begin with. But I mean, you also point out that if something you can overpay attention to something, but if there's no stakes attached to it at all, then maybe we don't get, we can get too much noise, either from overemphasis or too little signal from kind of underappreciation of the potential value of it. Um, I think when we do something like try to use a standardized measure, it's always going to be subject to that. Um, those sorts of risks. That's another reason why we probably could use multiple measures and modalities of measuring things so that we can triangulate, right? So if one piece of information is good, if we had three pieces of information that all purported to gather, uh, you know, complementary information, that's probably better, right? So if we had a survey measure of engagement or interest, uh, or if I were a college or a university, right? And someone's interested in attending my school, I have their SAT scores, I have their GPA, and then I have some like qualitative statements, right, from their essays that tell me about like what it is they want to do, how they connect with education. And if all three of them are not gameable, right, maybe across all three of them, I get a more holistic sense of like what it is. Now, could we do that at scale in K-12 education? Probably. I think elementary school teachers regularly do things that look like this. But I think once we get to the secondary level, we mostly, from my experience in schools, don't do that. And I think we could probably do a better job of thinking like holistically or multidimensionally. Um, we'd probably have to trade off other things, right? We collect a lot of information. We ask people to spend a lot of time on things. We probably have to trade off other things um, if we wanted better or different information.
Hmm. I wonder, because you also mentioned you taught for 5 years. On the ground level, I feel like when a teacher or even a student has to deal with these kind of standardized forces, it can seem like a hassle, like I gotta do all these things. Because oftentimes they may not actually be involved at the policy level of like maybe the potential benefits of collecting that data. Could you maybe provide like an example where some sort of metrics like this helped shape some policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this is probably not the best example, but it's the one that's cropping up, right? So one of the things that led me back to grad school was the fact that I knew standardized test score performance was being used to make scheduling decisions for students because, for instance, the school was not making adequate yearly progress, let's say on math and reading. And we knew who was not doing well on those particular tests. So we could come up with an intervention program, right, to try to improve their performance. Um, on the one hand, I would say like us using that data to identify one that in aggregate we were not performing super well, but in particular we knew which students were not sort of performing at the level that the state and federal government thought that they should be. We could come up with intervention programs to boost their literacy and numeracy skills. Um, I think what happened in the short term was like it went from that like good use of data to improve outcomes to an overemphasis on trying to improve test scores such that we started taking other elective courses out of student schedules, and I think that maybe had a long-term negative effect. And where I think we got to a more productive space was realizing that there were lots of ways that there were maybe unintended consequences of the original focus that led to better formulations, right? Like looking for flexibility, looking for multiple measures, adding things like school completion or college and career readiness. The policy could evolve to be more multidimensional in ways that were maybe not the original intent of, for instance, test-based
Mm,
accountability, but sort of led to a better version of maybe what was intended at the outset.
mm. I think this I'm assuming this must happen all the time because I feel like being a student having to take these tests and now being on the other side where I like teach, but I also get to, I took the GRE later with a very different framework. And I weirdly enjoyed taking the test. I actually feel like I learned the vocabulary that I read helped me read all these books that I don't think I would have been able to read before. I ended up learning all this random information from all the passages that they threw at you. Like I thought about it like a challenge and I was like, let me try to challenge myself and just see what I can learn in this process. And I learned a lot. And I tell some of my students now where I'm like, I think rather than studying for the test, the best thing you can do for the English section, for example, is just read. Like read and then let's critically engage with whatever you're reading, whatever it is that you care about, whatever it could be fiction, it could be about League of Legends, it doesn't matter what it is. Once we read it critically, we can analyze it, and that will just help you naturally without even having to study for the test. And so in some ways, I do think what the tests are asking are actually valid. I mean, I think the math section is well made. I don't think it's like ridiculous, but at the same time, I also did go to a SAT prep class growing up. And I also know from that framework, I did not care to learn about any of it. I was just like, I need a good score so I can get to a good school. I didn't even know what I was doing or why. And I think that that messaging difference is where the problem often lies, where it's like on the ground level, even if the test is made with relatively great intentions, if someone doesn't really care to learn, no matter what metric you throw at them, it's just going to be an obstacle I need to get over or game, where the learning process is completely removed from that unless you genuinely care about learning. And so that's why I think now a lot of my work is really curious just about what is the process that happens for someone to care, to connect and care about whatever it is that they're learning. Do you feel like the more importance we placed on these kind of metrics, we actually move farther and farther and farther away from that?
I do. That's a definite worry. Is that the more emphasis we placed on the standardized tests, whether it's the SAT or a state required test for graduation, the less space we created to focus on authentic ways for people to care about learning, and connect with learning. Now, I mean, to your point, like developmentally, it's harder to convey that, right? Like as an adult learner, you can have different perspective than you do as an adolescent learner. Some of that's about brain development, some of this is about life experience. But one thing I think we have to keep in mind is like the importance of creating environments for everybody that where they have the opportunity to find that authentic connection, right? So let's say if we dial back the focus on test scores, right, and we create more space for people to be able to authentically engage or find opportunities to connect meaningfully, we have to make sure that everybody has access to that because the risk is that the people who are naturally inclined to do that will do that. But that if we don't know how to create spaces, opportunities, create human connections, share resources with people who don't immediately make that connection, facilitating that ability to make that connection, I think it's outside my expertise. There are probably people who know how to do this, but it strikes me as like then that becomes the imperative is making time for it, but then finding ways to help facilitate that would become a more central role of the educator in the education system. It's not obvious to me that we're set up to do that so that everybody sort of benefits similarly.
Hmm.
And
Uh,
I
mhm.
can I can take it a step further and say, for part of my high school experience, I went to two different public high schools and one private selective high school. And I graduated. I started at and graduated from a public, but in between, I noticed this selective private school. It was a Quaker high school in suburban Philadelphia. It was a fantastic experience, but I also realized they were able to facilitate like just a qualitatively different educational experience. Um, a lot of the students who were at that school were from very high income households. I was not among them, but I was also from a middle class household. So I was starting with a lot of advantage. Um, in those spaces, it was relatively easy for the educators to set up, but in part because of the school's philosophy, in part because of its pedagogical approach, but in part because they largely served children from pretty advantaged backgrounds. And I think figuring out how to do this for students across all environments who are carrying different sort of baseline like needs when and resources when they walk into the building. It would be critical to doing this in ways that really advance right human development.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to get into this and to talk about how these kind of play out across different socioeconomic, racial, and just different kind of groups. But before we get into that, the thing I really want to understand is I remember I was reading this a long time ago, this paper on the history of grades. I thought it was really fascinating, but it seems that what a grade is, or what any of these numbers or metrics are, is it's a way for us to communicate about a person's capacities across large spaces of just large space. So, for example, if my entire school and my entire life is just going to be inside of my town, there's no need necessarily for a grade. I just need feedback. If I'm not doing something well, I need feedback. But because everyone knows each other, everyone kind of knows what people's strengths and weaknesses are. But all of a sudden now, I might need to go to a college across the country. I might need to even go to a college or get a job across in a different country altogether. And so in that case, you need something to be able to communicate, this is what this person is capable of doing. And that's where these type of metrics, I think, come to play, because you can't write entire paragraphs for every single person where people are reading. So you have something quick like an A, and you're like, oh, okay, this person understands this well. But what I wonder is how useful it really is for the student themselves. Because, okay, I take a SAT test and I figure out that I'm at a four, whatever. Let's say I get a 1200 or 1100. And then I study a lot and the next year I get a 1200. I don't really, I might feel a slight difference, but it's not really even clear like how much I've learned, how much I've grown as a person, or it's not, it's, I'm aiming for something, but that something could have been anything. How many colors can I identify? Like how high can I jump? It really could be anything if the goal is just to train your ability to learn and improve. But this particular thing doesn't seem to be too connected to learning in any sense. So I guess what I'm curious about is like, do you feel like the monopolization of knowledge by higher education specifically, which makes you have to like then do well on this test and then do well on this, actually as a whole reduces people's just learning throughout that entire process? Because imagine if no one learned to get into college. Then you would have to I mean, because that seems to be why anyone even does any of it anymore. I mean, imagine if you went through those 12 years, there was no goal after, you just learned, and then something happened. I don't know. I'm just so curious what that would look like, where there was no point.
Oh, sorry. Apologies for difficulty unmuting. Um, I do think that especially among high achieving students, right, or students who've had a lot of success and or have a really strong orientation towards success on the dimensions that you just laid out, right? That know that getting good grades and high test scores might have value in and of themselves, right? It's good to be good at something. It's nice to get positive feedback, but also are a means to some other end. And this other end is higher education. And in particular, I think what you're pointing out is like competitively admitted higher education, which in part is valuable because it's a scarce resource, right? That said, I mean, most people who are enrolling in college, first of all, are at community colleges, which are open enrollment. And beyond that, most of the people who are enrolled in a four-year school are enrolled in a four-year school with pretty high acceptance rates. But actually, I think one of the miscarriages of justice in K-12 education is not communicating that. I didn't know it when I was applying to college, and I know that was a long time ago, but I think it was true then, and no one told me that. And maybe the counselors at my high school didn't know either. But I think this is like important information that people should have. Most schools are not super competitively admitted. The top colleges and universities absolutely are. But let's say out of 250 that maybe would fall into that category, there are about 3,000, right? Four-year institutions just in the United States. Most of them they're not open enrollment, but they're closer to it. Now there's the cost piece also, but I think we have so created a focus on achievement on these dimensions and its relationship to elite and competitively admitted higher education that I think that contributes to an overemphasis on that. And to
Mm,
your point, I think if there were ways of dialing that back, that probably could lead to more authentic learning. The challenge is no one wants to be the one to dial it back because all else equal, they'd like their opportunity to pursue that, right? And I went to a flagship public university for undergrad, and I went to an elite private university for my doctorate. So like I get it. I'm not, but there is that sort of like trade off, and how do you step back from the arms race that has become competitively admitted public, higher education.
Hmm. A lot of this for me, when I hear you even say a lot of that, is just I think when learning becomes the end in itself. I was actually just having a conversation with someone, one of my students' parents actually, and they said something along the lines of, at the end of the day, education has to be rooted in reality. So, you know, even if you enjoyed learning, you still need to eventually get a job to pay for your life. Which I just find to be so interesting because there's this belief that if you just learn to learn, somehow you're going to end up in a place where you're no longer able to find employment, where somebody who just learns to get into college will. That's the part to me that I've always found really interesting because in real examples, anyone who I find who's just fascinated by the world, fascinated by people who just learn because that's a natural process what they do. I mean, they're so intelligent in so many different complex like holistic ways. And so I don't know where that fear also rises where it's like, okay, if they're not solely driven by these like external achievements, then somehow they're as a whole they're going to actually learn less. I mean, do you do you hear these type of conversations come up talking about metrics and if we were to like dial down the importance on them and things like that?
I do, and I definitely. I mean, it's a long-standing debate, certainly in U.S. In the U.S. Thinking about like what is the primary purpose of education, right? Is it primarily about like learning for the sake of learning and creating an informed citizenry, or is it more vocational in focus? And I think it's a privilege of those who don't have a lot of material want to say that it's like learning for learning's sake, right? And I could even say if I was like relatively less well off, that I still think that learning for learning's sake, being informed, being well educated, being curious, I think is a natural good, and I would like everyone to be uh, to have that as a motivation. Um, but I can balance that with the reality that it's true. We all have to find a way towards sustaining ourselves economically. I mean, I take your point. I don't see these as disjoint realities, right?
Yeah.
That if um, that said, I mean, there is this, right? Like economists make a distinction between like human capital versus signaling benefits of educational credentials, right? So does the college degree, for instance, demonstrate that you have a bunch of skills and knowledge, right? That separates you from someone who doesn't have that college degree potentially to an employer, and is that what's valuable to them, or is it the signal, right? The like, oh, you went to this particular place, and I think this means that, right? Or you have this particular type of degree independent of the institution, and that signals to me X. Um, I think folks who take the opinion like, oh, what you study needs to lead to a job are implicitly focusing more on the signaling value, right? Because you have a degree in business administration, people will understand that you can do X, as opposed to having, to be unfair to philosophers, a philosophy degree, right? And then it's not as evident like what a future employer maybe should take from that. I think that's what people are implying, that it's less obvious what that signals. Um, and I think that's like oversimplifying reality.
Mm, yeah. I guess transitioning this conversation, I mean, there's so much, this stuff is just so fascinating to me because I think you cannot separate American education from a lot of these metrics and from standardized testing and from the higher education system. I mean, they've become so married that you don't really have one without the other. And so I, one thing that I'm really curious to understand is when we talk about people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, I think testing impacts people from different resources very, very differently. Because, for example, if I was to take a test and I do relatively well, or I have the belief that I can do better, that perhaps postures me in a certain way with my relationship to learning. Where there are some people, I just think once you've left the kind of schooling world, you just realize how many different strengths there are in the world. I mean, the types of things that you need to be a great foreman is just so different than the types of skills you need to be a great, whatever, bus driver. Or, I mean, they're all so different. And so there's no like just one standard of what it means to be able to fully highly function in this world. And so something I'm curious about is for students who take these standardized tests or metrics and feel like they've fallen very short and also don't have maybe the hope that they can do much better. Are there a lot of like negative impacts that come with that?
I think there can be. I think we have some good evidence actually from the era of high stakes test-based accountability that show that that's sort of getting a negative signal, right? So falling below, like for instance, the proficiency threshold on your eighth grade test really could have some pretty profound like downstream implications. Or falling just above it. So you're proficient and I'm not proficient. And there was one question that separated our scores, right? But you get a different word attached to your performance than I get to mine. We have some pretty good evidence that there are implications much further afield, right? Like at the college level, based on a test you take in eighth grade. So I think those signals matter. But I think if we could counterbalance that with another dimension or multiple dimensions of performance where people can connect with like, oh, this test may not have gone this particular way, right? But there are other ways that I'm demonstrating my knowledge that make me feel efficacious, right? That help me connect with meaning, or feel confident that there are things that I do and can learn, that have value, right? But I
Mm,
think especially as youth are developing, we know that like how they develop their self-concept is important. And so I think having competing counterbalancing measures to inform that are critical.
And so what are some do you have any examples of what some of those counterbalances are?
Um, I mean, for me, part of what motivated me to study some of what I study in career and technical education came out of the fact that when I was teaching high school, I taught students who were a year or more behind grade level in math. Some of the students I taught we had a regional technical high school that was adjacent to our campus, and students went there half time if they wanted to participate in one of the technical education programs that we didn't offer in our building. Um, but in order to get to go there, they had to show up for for the comprehensive high school half of the day. And I found that like they found that my students found it really positively reinforcing, right? They found like, oh, I go there, I like doing this, I'm learning something, I'm good at it, I feel like it has meaning, I can see the value in it beyond the school walls. And so they would, kind of endure the rest of it. So I think to the extent that we can have other non-test based authentic opportunities, right, to learn, I think that helps. And I think you can have good grades that show that you are hardworking and dedicated and are learning that may not show up in the same way on tests. And I think reminding students of the value of the things that go into producing like other forms of positive performance are similarly useful.
Yeah. I guess like that to me that sounds like just like also developing a certain level of critical awareness that the test doesn't actually represent your intelligence and to really question like who makes these tests? What do they benefit from it? Why does it exist? Why are they questioning what they're questioning? I think that can always be really helpful.
Yeah, and not being too reductionist, right, in the way we present it, that like people can be responsible in the way they create tests, can pay attention to not having them be biased, right? Like we can do all of that in ways that are responsible and responsive to the environment around us. and still recognize that that's one way of capturing information about what people know in this particular way, right?
Mm,
We have to entirely discount the testing endeavor uh, in order to like highlight the value in other pursuits.
mm. That is, I think, where a lot of times the dialogue becomes so complex. And I think as data scientists or whatever, being in that world, I think sometimes you get this really intimate view of the people who think about these things, and it's not so reckless, I think, all the time, where it is easy from the outside to kind of bash, a lot of these like organizations for maybe just being reckless or not really thinking it through. But you're right. Sometimes things that are done, there's a nice quote which is like the solutions of today are the problems of tomorrow, which I feel like are really fair, where I'm like a lot of these things were done often sometimes with good intention to fix a particular problem, but then once that becomes normalized, then there are new problems that arise and then but it's not like the problems arose because somebody intentionally was like I want these problems to exist all the time. Sometimes it does, but not all the time.
Though this is not my area of expertise, this next thing that I'll share, I think about frequently, right? That like to your point about the solutions of today become the problems of tomorrow. Like I'm acutely aware of where I live and that the whaling industry used to dominate a lot of this region. I think we find it like my children can't conceive of the fact that whale oil was what provided a lot of the fuel in New England, right? Like 150 years ago. Just like I'm sure 150 years from now, we won't be able to conceive of the way that we were producing energy, electricity, et cetera, the way that we are now. Um, and I think just having that sort of perspective, even when we think about paradigms in education policy, and recognize that like science advances, our knowledge can advance. But if we don't, I mean, it takes time, right? Right. We're living in real time while also trying to improve. Um, and then finally, that like, democracy and science interact in messy ways, right? And sometimes
Mm,
like political compromise doesn't capture all of the dimensions of the best science, um, even under like good intentions.
mm. I guess to close off this conversation, I'm kind of curious to just hear your future predictions, I guess, in some ways, of what you feel like these type of metrics and are going to look like, 50 years from now, 100 years, however far you want to look out. What do you feel like it looks like? What do you think education, I guess, looks like in relation to these metrics moving forward?
So at least in the current political moment, which is always a bad measure of anything because these things can be fleeting, but I mean there has been a concerted effort towards college and career readiness as an alternative to college for all as a policy paradigm. Sort of acknowledging that like the ways to and through post-secondary education and training can be more varied than like seamlessly enrolling in a four-year college, getting a degree in 4 to 6 years, and then entering the workforce where that degree provides a positive return on investment. We sort of know that that didn't play out entirely the way we intended and is connected to some of what we've been talking about, like tests and test scores. Um, you know, in 100 years, we've developed and haven't moved too far away from using standardized measures of knowledge. I'd like to say that in 100 years from now, we'll still be using some of these measures because they're efficient. But maybe what we're measuring will have expanded, right? So maybe we'll the SAT writing or the GRE writing tests, maybe we'll be able to better gauge people's ability to write in ways that will add that as a dimension of communication that we don't capture right now. Maybe measures of like meaning and purpose that people find in education or what they connect to in ways that are more authentic or captivating to them. Maybe we'll have developed some of those things too, and just have a more multifaceted, right?
Yeah.
Multi-dimensional perspective um,
Can
on, yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Because sorry, it's just this brought up one more thing because I think it's really fascinating in that I've always been curious what the motivation to do something like that is. The IQ, for example, in theory, was something that you take and it should be stable-ish your whole life, no matter what. And so let's say in the future we're able to come up with a much better metric where what you score when you're in the first grade accurately captures to maybe 1 point difference for where you'll ever be in your life. Is that something we even want to create?
I don't think so. And the reason why is that we know whatever we think that like unidimensional construct might collect, we also know that people grow in their awareness and capacity, right? Their interest or enthusiasm for things, and all of that matters as much as like where you might be on some continuous distribution of underlying ability, right? That because that's necessarily going to be a reduced number of dimensions of ability or value. And I think as human individuals, we have lots of ways of contributing value to our
Hmm.
families, our communities, and society. And I think that trying to reduce that value to one dimension um, does everybody a disservice, right?
Yeah.
So even if we could perfect the way that we capture something, and we should want to perfect lots of things, I think dwelling on just one dimension uh, is always going to have the potential to do more harm than good.
Hmm. I mean, this space is really fascinating, and I wanted to say thank you for joining us today and sharing all your insight because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, between how people perceive a lot of the metrics that happen and like what and between so understanding it from the people who are creating the methods, understanding how the data is being used, understanding what that connection is between what happens at the ground level and what happens at policy. I feel like revealing and shining a light on all that can just provide so much more awareness of the entire system from what happens beyond just the student actually taking the test. Uh, and so, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's been my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to think about this. And one thing I'll add, if you don't mind,
Of course.
is uh, I think our ability to deal with much larger, more complex data systems has improved over the last 100 years in the same way that like we've advanced the methods that we use to analyze that data. As our ability to deal with more complex data grows, right, it might also reduce our reliance on any one particular metrics, right? It might be the efficiency gains from what we've been using over the last 50 years could be eclipsed by our ability to relatively efficiently under new computing capacity deal with more complex information. And so in that sense, we'll probably continue doing some of the types of things that we've done in the past, but we'll have a like different set of opportunities based on the evolution of technology and our ability to analyze more complex data.
Hmm. I'm excited. I'm
So
looking forward to see what else happens. So, but definitely, I would love to have you back on later in the future and see what kind of progression and what else changes. I know Boston College starting something new, so that's pretty exciting.
yes, I think there'll be lots of opportunity for further conversation. I really appreciate you inviting me today.
Yeah. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I'm excited to get a kickoff on this season. Have a great week. And as per usual, stay re-educated.